At this point, my feedback form is built and fully functional, but it still doesn't look that good. The default gray background is kind of drab, and the fonts in the text and entry fields are different. The final step in building my feedback form GUI is to modify its style and appearance to give it a unique professional look. The first thing I recommend doing when you're working with a brand new top-level window is to change the text on the Windows title bar from the default TK to something meaningful. We can do that by calling the master root window and using the title method, and we'll give a label of Explore California Feedback. Next, I also want to prevent the user from being able to resize my survey window, and so I'll configure that by using the resizable method on the master window, and I'll pass in false, false. The default gray background is rather boring, so I want to change it to something in line with the Explore California brand. I can change my background color for the master window by using the configure method. Type master.configure background equal, and I'm going to pass in a hex value, E1, D8, B9, and this is the hex value that corresponds to the background shade of brown, which matches the Desert to Sea logo. Now, that only changes the color of the master window's background. All of the widgets still have a default gray for their background. I'll demonstrate that by running it. You can see a little bit of brown around the back there, but my other widgets are still covered in gray. Rather than change the background of each of those widgets individually, we can use the TTK styles object to modify the default background for each widget type. I'll create a styles object, which I'll save to a class variable called style, using the ttk.style constructor method. Now, using this style object, I can configure the styles for the different widgets within my program. So I'll call self.style, configure, and first, let me configure the background that I'll use for the frames. The name for the frame style is tFrame. We learned about this in the earlier video on the style object. And I'll configure the background for that to be the same as my master window. I'll do the same thing with the style object to configure the background for the T button to be the same. And I'll just copy this line. We'll also configure the label to have the same background color. Now, all of those elements should have the same background. Let's run the code to check. Sure enough, things are starting to look a little bit better. So let's focus on the font. I want to customize my labels to use a size 11 Arial font. And I can do that here in the configure statement by configuring the font property. And I'll use a list with Arial specified as the font, and I'll use size 11. So now all the labels in my program will use size 11 font. Except that's not exactly what I want. If I look back at the program, I want this "Thanks for exploring" message to be much larger and bolder than the lower instructional message to the user. So let me create a unique style to use for that header statement. Going back here, I'm going to copy the T-label statement. And now I'm going to create a new type of label style called header.tlabel. We don't need to configure the background for that because it'll be the same as the label background, which will be inherited into T-label. But we do want to change the font. Instead of using size 11, we'll use size 18, and we'll make it bold. So now all of my labels will have the same background color. The regular labels will use size 11 font, and the header label will use size 18 bold font. Now that I've created that style, I also need to tell my header label to use that style, and I can do so by setting the style property. Style equal header.tlabel. The last thing we'll need to configure are the fonts for the input fields. Since the text widget is not a themed TK widget, we cannot use the TTK style object to configure its fonts. But we can configure the font for the TK widget directly by configuring the font property in the constructor method. Down here, I'll set font equal Arial, and we'll use size 10 in the text widget. Now, since the entry widgets are themed TK widgets, we should be able to configure the font property for the T entry style once to change the default font for both of them. However, there is currently a bug which prevents the font configured for the T entry style from properly displaying in the entry widget. I submitted a bug report to the Python community about this issue, and it appears the problem exists somewhere within the TK framework. Hopefully that'll be resolved soon, but at the time of this recording, the problem still exists, so I'll have to work around it by configuring the fonts individually for each of the two entry widgets. I'll specify font equals Arial 10, and I'll just copy that and put that down in the email entry widget as well. That completes the style changes to my survey form GUI. Let's save and run the program and see how it looks. Much better. It's now clean, professional looking, and ready for the public to see.